All right. I believe it's recording now. All right.
Yep.
So to start us off, please introduce yourself, Dr. Wang, to everyone that's going to be watching later.
Sure. My name is, Dr. Sherry Wang. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am a Taiwanese American and an immigrant woman. I came to the US at the age of 6 and grew up in California from Los Angeles, but now I'm in the Bay Area.
Oh, a big move. I'm also near SoCal too, Dr. Wang.
Oh, where?
I'm from Garden Grove. It's in Orange County. It's like
Okay.
5 minutes out from Disneyland. Perfect. Cool. All right. Dr. Wang, would you like to include like what do you do as well, your occupation?
Perfect. Yes. So I'm an associate professor of counseling psychology at Santa Clara University in the Bay Area. I'm also a licensed counseling psychologist, and in the last year and a half, I've been doing a lot of media interviews, and domestically with kind of mainstream media, but also with foreign media, as well as with Chinese speakers in the U.S. Trying to really talk right about anti-Asian racism and the importance of combating it and how do we do it.
Yes, with your work at Voss, we align a lot with your values. You mentioned you were like an immigrant woman, Taiwanese. Tell us about how your AAPI identity and experiences influence the work that you do and like the occupation that you do.
Absolutely. So, as I mentioned, I'm an immigrant and I'm a child of immigrant parents who came to the U.S. to a suburb in LA at the age of 6. So I feel like with immigrants, we straddle multiple worlds, and not just the country of origin and the host country, but also generationally, right? Seeing the sacrifices our parents make, that they continue to make, trying to reconcile what kind of mainstream and current generation kind of expectations are like with our own families. And so for me, growing up in a predominantly Asian community, I think that's a big part of who I am today.
Yes.
And what has shaped me, because the reason I became a psychologist and my specialty is in immigrant and refugee mental health. That was what I went to get my doctorate for, right, as a counseling psychologist, because I grew up in an Asian community, and yet there was so much diversity amongst us that people didn't know about, right?
Yes.
But when you're growing up in it, you don't know. And so I just, I knew I was really privileged, right? And things like having two parents, being in a family that's very being voluntary immigrants as opposed to being involuntary, right? Refugee
Yes.
kind of families, having class privilege even, right? And tied alongside to our kind of migration process. And so a lot of things that I really wanted to advocate for in going into psychology was being able to not only just understand our communities and the diversities, because people don't usually think about Asian Americans beyond like the stereotypes of high achieving, right? The model minority myth, things like that.
Yes.
But they don't know things like Asian gangs, for example, or what
Yeah.
happens when you fail as an Asian
Yes.
American. And so there are a lot of things that I felt like we needed to educate mainstream perspectives from a perspective about Asian Americans that isn't deficit based, right? So
Yes.
to not have people tell our stories when they don't know our cultures, plural, right? Because it's really
Yes.
diverse. And so
Yes.
to really make sure that I also was able to kind of recognize my own privileges, right? To be able to advocate for other communities. Because if you think about it, most people only know about like Chinese, Korean, Japanese,
Yes.
the big three, East
Yes.
Asians. And so I do think it's incumbent for us, right? I identify as Taiwanese American and Chinese as well, to speak up for my South Asian, my Southeast Asian
Yes.
siblings in ways that would be different if non-Asian Americans spoke
Yes.
about our communities and tried to understand us in a way that was probably more like all Asians are this way.
Yes. That was so beautifully put, Dr. Wang. No, yeah, I feel like with the model minority myth, it's so common and so easy for people to grab like place the term umbrella term Asian American and just ignore all the disparities. And I feel like that happens a lot. And especially with the COVID pandemic going on, with the increase in anti-Asian hate and discrimination, like with the rise of anti-Asian hate, you mentioned that you were working on combating it through your work. Tell us about any changes in your work since the COVID pandemic has arisen. Were there any new strategies or approaches that like didn't work before that work now?
Sure. I think the thing that's come up that I'm really trying to highlight more about since COVID has really been about, how we talk about anti-Asian racism. Like even, if we think about the hashtag like stop AAPI hate, I have critiqued it a little bit because AAPI references Asian American Pacific Islanders, but we are actually not actually talking about Pacific Islander
Yeah.
experiences, right? So the ways in which we kind of like tack these labels, but they're not really representing those experiences.
Yes.
We're not actually honoring those experiences. Or when we talk about APIDA, right? APIDA, Asian
Yes.
Pacific Islander, Desi Americans,
Mhm.
we're oftentimes forgetting or excluding, the South Asian Desi community. And so being really intentional when we advocate for Asian Americans,
Yes.
who are we talking about? Who are we focusing on? And then how do we do that without forgetting the diversities of our communities, and at the same time also recognizing the complexities, because we've gone to war with each other as
Yes.
Asian countries, with Asian, our histories, and so one of the things that happened, during this period with COVID was I was also on maternity leave, so I also gave birth during this period.
Oh, I love kids. I just love hearing about them. I will ask about a son or a daughter.
2 daughters.
You're lucky. You're lucky. I like girls too.
Yeah, so I was surprised with twins, which has been amazing and a steep learning curve. But I was at home, it meant, and I am thinking I'm really an educator, in my heart. I think even as a psychologist, as a practicing clinician, I think about it as like the more you know, the more empowered you can be. And so I started a professional Instagram account. It's just Dr. Sherry C. Wang, and the point of that was really because I felt like I needed to just let folks know what was happening, through a different perspective than what they're seeing in the mainstream. And I say that because I had friends, kind of in my personal Instagram account or even in my Twitter, say things like, okay, I'm cutting off my family member. They're not coming over to Thanksgiving because they're
Yeah.
pro-Trump or because they're anti-Black. And these were Asian Americans. Primarily, these were my Southeast Asian friends, who were cutting off their Vietnamese parents, right? Or their Hmong parents, because their families were saying things like, I agree with Trump. I agree with calling it Kung Flu, down with China, down with Chinese people.
Yeah.
And so, of course, then Asian American youth, Asian American identifying folks are really angry and being like, what are you talking about? Like, we need to come together and support,
Yeah.
our communities. If you feel this way about other Asian Americans, how do you feel about the Black community? So really kind of this anti-Blackness that was coming up in our older generations, and the younger generation really being angry, right? And wanting to do something, but then also cutting off families, probably not the thing we want to do during COVID or in general, right? It's
No.
already isolating as
Mhm.
it is. So I found that I was doing a lot of educating, in terms of helping people think about like, well, if you think about it, your parents likely don't identify as American, right? Like Asian American. They identify as Vietnamese, period. If
Period.
my parents identify as Chinese or Taiwanese, period. And
Yes.
so it's a very different identity in terms of feeling the solidarity for other Asian Americans, wanting to speak up, and also during their time, they didn't protest. They were so busy with, kind of shutting up, putting up, so that they
Yeah.
can build a roof over our heads and give us these best experiences. But so this is, I know I'm telling a long story, and I promise there's a point.
No, I love this.
Yeah, I'm glad, because I was like, this is kind of running on, but I promise the point in that is to say that if we only look at our parents, and our grandparents and that generation from a white supremacist Eurocentric lens, then it looks like Asian Americans don't speak up, that we're quiet, passive, submissive, deferential, all these stereotypes that have been used actually, right, to make us inferior, actually, right? That those didn't come from our communities, right? And
Yes.
so if we, though, look at it from our EMIC lens, right? EMIC is really more of like our culture sensitive, indigenous lens.
Yeah.
We understand that, for example, Asian American women are not docile and passive and
Yes.
quiet. I do not know any Asian American woman
I
like that.
agree. I agree.
I also don't know any Asian woman, period, like that, right? Thinking
I
about mothers and
agree.
grandmothers, like they rule the house, but they do it without disrupting the harmony, right?
I
So
That's so beautifully put, Dr. Wang. I feel like I do not have to look further than my mother to know that Asian women are not
they're
quiet.
strong. We're powerful. They're powerful. And so this stereotype is completely insensitive and completely culturally incongruent to
Mm,
what we actually know about. And this is just an example of Asian American women, right? I mean, I think Asian American men are super sexy. Also, I grew up only having crushes on Asian American men. And then I went
yes.
to college and grad school and I did online dating too. And I was like, I only want to date the Asian American men. And that was because I grew up seeing, I mean, California boys are also different, right? I also have to put that out there. But then, I dated, men, in the East Coast and the Midwest, and they would be like, me? You pick me? Are you sure you don't want to date a white person?
What?
Like, why me? And so this self-esteem that they didn't have really because they grew up in predominantly white societies that made them think they were not sexy, that they were not masculine, that they're not attractive. So that's what I mean by a lot of who I am is shaped by, having grown up in LA, in a suburb where it's the norm for me to see people that look like me and to watch TV and to hear language that resembles what we speak at home. And so, I do think that this notion with even well-intentioned Asian American activists saying things like, we have to speak up, we have to stand up, we have to protest, we can't be so passive, we can't be so right, inactive politically. It's like, wait a minute,
Wait.
whose lens are
When?
you using?
When? Yes.
When, right? We can't be the model minority. We've never given ourselves that
Been.
label.
Yes.
You are using a box that the oppressor gave us and now saying, let's go outside the box, but we're still centering around that box and the definition of who we are. Right. So I don't think we should be telling Asian Americans, like, you have to speak up, you have to speak out, because I think people weren't listening. And I think we just do it in ways that aren't the traditional notion of what activism looks like, in this contemporary context. It isn't
Yes.
protesting in the streets. That's not what our parents did, for example, right? And that is not how revolutions have happened in our parents' countries of origins, even.
Yes.
We disagree in different ways. And I just think it's important to honor that we do without unintentionally taking on white supremacy and then inflicting that into our own communities.
Yes. I agree. I feel like it's about starting like new conversations with our family members and our community members, like teaching them like different languages, like it's not in the past, like the what you said about like especially the social media activists. I see a lot of like Instagram posts and it says we are no longer the model minority myth. And in my head, I'm kind of like, I don't remember a time where we chose to be.
We've
Like
never been.
we've
Why
never
did you do
been.
that to us? Yeah.
Like I feel like it's just like it was labeled on us, and like sometimes we often go with the flow, and often I think like in some families and in some communities there often I do see it, there's often an approach of keeping your head down or like a heavy emphasis on like assimilation, because I remember growing up my parents would just be like, do good in school, like don't cause any problems, like if anyone's causing problems to you, just ignore it, like don't say anything back. And I feel like there's times obviously are changing, like do you have any ideas or strategies to approach this barrier or address like that challenge of like not just like keeping our head down? I feel like it's about teaching our parents to unlearn certain old ways.
Yeah, well, I do think that's not so much about like because we are not courageous or because we're scared. I think those were strategic things that our families
Yeah.
taught us, because in the societies that they grew up in, that's how you succeeded, right?
Mhm.
I often think that when we think about why Asian Americans, put their heads down, put up, shut up, right, and kind of
Yeah.
only kind of stay our lanes, it's really because we don't know the rules of the game in this
Mhm.
society. Right. And this is why I think like education is so important. And I do think that, to mobilize Asian Americans, the strategy, and I do think this comes from my psychologist identity and my psychology background of doing trauma-informed work, is that we want to empower people, right? And galvanize people rather than shame them and blame them. And I find that is also very cultural the shame piece,
Yes.
right? But shame does not sustain, right, people's momentum to change. And so I think in that way too, if we did more education for our families to let them know, the way to get a promotion, right, for example, isn't
Yes.
to shut up and put up.
Mhm.
It's actually to stand up for ourselves and to speak up and to make waves and to, even ripples. Like that is how it works
Yes.
now. Here's how the legal system works. Here's what happens when you sue somebody, for example. So like,
Yes.
right,
Yes.
teaching folks like legal pathways. I've done a lot of continuing education, in these last 2 years for, healthcare providers from medical doctors and of course, mental health care providers, but also lawyers, right? Really encouraging lawyers to do this work in terms of teaching folks, teaching the Asian American community, like, what are our rights? How do we advocate for ourselves through legal channels, for example, right? So that we don't think we have to do things the only way we know how. And because there's been language barriers, right? Because of the ways in which we've been ostracized from voting rights
Yes.
or being seen as Americans, we have a history in this country where we've been banned and we've been treated as outsiders, and we have
Mhm.
literally been excluded from being able to come to this country, right, on the basis
Yes.
of our country's origin. It's the only thing that's happened. We're the only community that's happened to, right?
Yes.
That has set the precedence now, right, for future immigration policy. The ways in which that those things have happened have made it so that we don't know the rules of the system. And if you don't know the rules of the game, you can't beat the game.
Yes. Yes, I agree. I feel like, do you think that there's like a change with the whole anti-Asian hate and discrimination going on? I feel like we've always been seen as the perpetual foreigner and like treated as outsiders. And I feel like with the current pandemic, it's made it worse. But I think we've been louder than we've ever been, especially during this time. But I think it's a matter of what you said about like education. So how do you think we can start these conversations with our family and community members? Because I feel like every time, personally, I, speaking like from personal experience, I would sit my parents down and then I talk to them about what's going on. And they would tell me, they're like, oh, like, I think that if I just like not looked at anyone when I went to the grocery store, and I was like, no, it's okay. Like, don't feel scared. Like, there's obviously reason to worry at the same time, but like, it's about speaking up too at the same time. I feel like where do we teach or start these conversations about the middle ground and even a bit of a push?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the thing, right, with the Stop Asian Hate, Stop AAPI Hate, is that I really want to make sure that we are not the only ones using this hashtag, as in like Asian Americans need to stop Asian hate. And I don't think that was the intention of it, but I feel like that is how it's happening, is that the
Yes.
same people who've been saying it are continuing to say it.
Mhm.
But really, Stop AAPI Hate, Stop Asian Hate, this is a societal problem, right? Like when we talk about racism happening, we shouldn't be looking to the victim communities and saying like,
Yes.
how are you going to stop racism? Right?
Mhm.
It's like telling a victim of sexual assault, how are you going to stop somebody from raping you? From right, from
Yes.
committing sexual assault against you. No, the problem should be telling the perpetrator stop, and
Yes.
we need to change that. And then we also need to hold bystanders responsible too. Like
Yeah.
when we go grocery shopping, when our elders go grocery shopping,
Mhm.
we wouldn't have to live in fear if we knew that other people would come to our aid, that other people wouldn't let it happen.
Yes.
This is about community accountability also, right? And about Asian Americans feeling safe and
Mhm.
supported and cared for and protected in our communities.
Yes. Back to a conversation we had earlier when you mentioned like the whole cutting our family members off. I often see it on social media as well, where like after a post, some would say, if you don't agree with me, please feel free to block me. And I feel like something like that is so counter like productive, simply because like we're fighting for ourselves. Like, if we keep only people who support us in our social media, like we're just talking to each other, like we're not reaching the right ears. And I feel like if you block the people that are the bystanders, that are complicit, that it's counterproductive. Like, these people do need to hear like what we want to say. Like, it's especially those people that need to hear, those that don't agree with us. And in specific, like Asian American activist clubs on campus where I go to school, like I remember hearing like, oh, like often these conversations make people uncomfortable, so we would like people that support us to come to our events. But at the same time, I feel like that's the point. We have to make them uncomfortable. They shouldn't feel comfortable in letting us stuff like this happen to us. They shouldn't feel comfortable in seeing it and ignoring it. And yeah, I agree with everything you said. So moving on to our next question, like here at Voss, like our goal is to challenge that cultural norm we talked about in Asian American communities of staying silent about our social and cultural issues. And in what ways, I feel like we talked about this already, that we challenge this cultural norm through education, through like re-educating others that we haven't been silent. Like it's just sometimes like we aren't getting heard. And I feel like, how do you think, like, I feel like it goes hand in hand with the model minority myth. Like, how can we deconstruct the model minority myth that stereotypes our community as the silent majority?
Yeah. So, I was able to, my mom helped me, right? Because I know some Mandarin, but to write it in the level for a Chinese newspaper is very different. But I did have two articles, right, in the Chinese newspaper in the US, I guess. I don't think it's just California. And the message that I had written for our Chinese community was I wanted to talk about anti-Blackness, because mainstream media had really, for a while, really created this image, right, that the perpetrators of anti-Asian racism were all Black people on the street, as though that is the only kind of racism we face, or as though that is the worst kind of racism we face. Of course, it was really targeting the most vulnerable in our communities, right? So it was very sensationalized in that way and got a lot of attention. But I really wanted to make the message for our community, for the Chinese community, of like, we can't be anti-Black, because I'm really kind of doing a little bit of education, right? And trying to be gentle in that way too, of highlighting, do you know that the model minority myth is used to compare us to the Black community, that its origins are anti-Black to make them look bad. It's not meant to make us look good, right? It was created to stereotype us, to valorize us as successful and hardworking. And in doing so, it allowed white America to pit us against the Black community, right? And to then ignore our suffering, ignore our pain, and to treat us as like a monolith of high achieving people, instead of a diverse group of people with very diverse needs. So I really kind of explained how the model minority myth hurts us, and how it really is pitting, right, communities of color against each other, and with the purpose of serving white supremacy, which then hurts all of us. I think that article did get some attention from folks. And I know certainly, like, for my family, my parents, who they reside in Taiwan now, right? Because for caretaking purposes, they're all in Taiwan. But for my mom, she was like, wow, I never knew that, because there are a lot of Asian Americans who still uphold the model minority myth because they think it's a compliment. Right. And they don't realize that it hurts the Black community. And when it hurts the Black community, it also hurts us, because all people of color are being forced to have to climb this racial hierarchy to just be proximal to whiteness, right? So I think this kind of education is really helpful for letting folks know, and not in like a judgmental way of like, now what are you going to do? Are you with this or are you against this? But just like for folks to know, and then to encourage them to be more critical in their thinking. I agree that if we limited our social circles to only those who think like us, we actually won't make any change. And that's why I encourage folks who want to cut off people or cancel people, that actually you're the only person that probably could reach family members in ways that we couldn't, right? Like, this is your social justice goal. And if you can have a little bit of patience, how powerful that could be. Because let's just say we're talking about anti-Blackness, for example, right? Because we're talking about how it is the model minority myth. The model minority myth is anti-Blackness, and the anti-Blackness is the model minority myth. And so it's so interconnected. And so how will Black people be able to reach our parents, our older generation, to change their minds? They won't, but we can. So there's so much, I think this way of thinking about it is so empowering. It gives so much hope and motivation to be like, what are the different strategies that I can try to help you think a different way? As opposed to shame, mom and dad, you need to think differently. I can't believe you're so backwards. I can't believe you don't have a bone of social justice in you, because it actually then perpetrates that white supremacy lens of us looking down on our families, thinking they're less than, and that they're inferior, and they're not.
No, I feel like it's just having that conversation rather than starting the whole fighting stance, like, oh, like you shouldn't think this way. It's just like, instead, like, we just help them relearn, like starting that, just a simple conversation, like, well, what have you thought of it this way instead? Like, I hear you. And it's just XYZ, like, but have you thought of this? Because I feel like the model minority myth also in turn, like, it is anti-black, and it also hurts like our own communities. But I feel like with especially older generations, like my parents are like, oh, that's like good, they think of us as hardworking. I'm like, it's disguised as like a series of compliments, but I feel like they're not taking in the disparities of the Asian American like umbrella. Like, we need like other disparities, like need certain like resources, and we aren't going to be able to get it if they don't take into account our cultural differences. And with that, it like also pits us against like what you said, like it pits us against POC versus PUC when that's totally not the case. So
We
I'd be like,
become used as an example of like,
yes,
see, racism doesn't exist because
yeah,
look at Asian Americans, look how well they're doing. So it treats us in this colorblind way. And I think when we
mm-hmm,
explain it in that way, they're like, no, we're not white.
yeah,
It's like, exactly. So do you see
exactly.
how it harms us?
Yes, yes. So moving forward, like what strategies do you suggest that we could mobilize our community members, including other racial and ethnic groups and policymakers, especially to address like anti-Asian hate and discrimination? Like, how
You
do
know,
we like help practice allyship ourselves and like reunite with others?
I think it has to be both, right? It has to
Mhm.
cross-racial solidarity and coalition building is the answer. Like the answer is very clear, actually.
Yes.
Okay, it's not a complicated answer, and it really is about us building our communities together. And I say that even to include white allies, because people think that
Hmm.
I'm being anti-white. No, I'm anti-white supremacy, which is a
Yes.
system of racism. But there are so many good white allies, and we need white allies. We need
Yes.
people who get to be in the rooms and get to sit at the tables
Yes.
and who get to like make decisions and
Mhm.
then speak for us and on behalf of us. And when we have opportunities to be in the rooms to speak up, then we got to speak up for those people who aren't there. We need to speak up for our Native
Mhm.
American siblings, right? We got to
Yes.
speak up for Black people who are not there and our Latinx communities. We got to speak
Mhm.
up about disability, right? About
Mhm.
classism, like all of these things, because that's what community is. It means like other people will look out for you and
Yeah.
we will look out for other people.
For
But
them.
that's very different than a tit for tat thing. Like if you
Yeah.
look out for me, then I will look out for you, right? So I
Yes.
think it's an intrinsic motivation that can't be ignited by shame, right? Because we need it to sustain and be motivated over time. And so I think this is where Asian pride, it used to be when I was in high school, we had like
Mhm.
AZN, right? Pride. We
Yeah.
break that. And I'm still living that though. Like I have so much pride in being Asian American
Yeah.
and seeing people like you and the work that Voss is doing and feeling
Mhm.
so proud and connected and driven, right, to
Yes.
better not just our communities, because I know folks doing this work also want to elevate all other
Oh,
marginalized communities.
yes.
And that is actually when people say like, well, where are the role models for Asian Americans, right? Like people, oftentimes like, well, I didn't have role models for Asian American activism. We haven't been activistic. I cannot begin to disagree with that more than I,
Yes.
in terms of like,
Mhm.
yeah, not only do we have so many activists, that's the problem, is that people don't know about the activists
Mhm.
that are in our society. Because, and here's the thing, this is what I think is so special about being Asian American. The activists and the movers and shakers, right, who have been Asian American, who have made significant impact in our society when it comes to civil rights, right, and social justice, have never only fought for Asian Americans,
Mhm.
ever. So I'm thinking about like Yuri Kochiyama, political
Yes.
activist.
Yes.
She fought for
Mhm.
Black liberation. She was there holding Malcolm X, right, when he died, when members of the Black community turned on him even, right? So
Yes.
she was there for him even when the Black community wasn't. Larry Itliong, right? He's the
Yes.
Filipino labor hero who changed our worldview actually on farm labor. He was the one that organized labor, and he invited Cesar Chavez to join the fight for civil rights and labor rights for farm laborers. Cesar Chavez got
Wow.
the reputation, right, and has gotten
Yes.
the attention, but actually it should have been Larry Itliong,
Mhm.
right? And then like
Yes.
we talk about police brutality. Hello, in 19, I'm trying to think like what year, like 1975, I think, Peter Yu, he was a
Mhm.
police brutality protester. He intervened in New York City, Chinatown, when this police officer was built. The police officer was beating up like a 15-year-old teen over a traffic violation,
Oh
right?
gosh.
And for that, Peter Yu was severely beaten. They stripped him, they beat him, they arrested him, they beat him some more, and it elicited such anger from the Chinatown community in New York to protest police brutality and have signs and demonstrations. So to say that Asian Americans are not involved in activism is such an internalization of white supremacy. And I say that not only for Asian Americans to believe that, for other people of color and white people too, who don't know our history and our contributions, because we've never marketed it as like we do it for Asians only, Asian power.
Yes.
We care about the whole society. And when we win, everybody wins.
Yes.
And so I think understanding that helps us see that, like, this is why when Asian Americans do well, other communities will do well. When Black communities do well, all of us can do well.
All of us do well.
And that mentality, I think, allows us to then encourages us to want to pull ourselves and each other up, rather than fall into this white supremacist competition of we will fight to the death, right? So that we can get that 1% slice of the pie. It's like Squid Games, right?
Yeah.
And we're being watched to fight for the deaths to get a little bit of something when there's so much more that all of us should be entitled to.
Yes. I feel like it's not about like who gets to sit at the table. It's like when one sits at the table, then another is able to sit at the table. It's not like who gets to sit at the table first. And I feel like when all of us are able to eat at the table, then everyone can start eating at the table as well. I feel like when one of us, like you said, when one of us wins, like another person wins as well. And then it's so sad. Like I do see a lot of we don't see a lot of Asian American activists, but I feel like it's like the world shakers and those that are doing something. It's not in just the big things that as well. Growing up, I feel like when I watched like YouTube channels, especially like Ryan Higa, like all the Asian Americans, like YouTubers, it's nice to see them on the screen. Like, it's nice to see like their voice on the screen, people who like look like us. Like I'm like, I see them and it's very empowering. I think it's like little things like that as well. So
yeah, it's nice when we see. I was just like, I was, a comedy show, a TikTok, right? That somebody's Asian American, and it's not like here's an Asian American TikToker. This is just somebody that's funny, and they're also Asian American. We don't want to discount the complexity and the richness of their identities, but to also celebrate that, it doesn't always have to be named in that way. Like that's really important too, right? I do think so. I think one of the big points that I do want to make though is that if we continue to only focus on hate, like stop Asian hate, we really won't make that much change, because the reality is most of the common, daily, frequent racism that happens in general, right? But since we're talking about Asian Americans, for Asian Americans is covert and complicit. It's in the form of microaggressions.
Yes.
Right. It's about our invisibility and our lack of representation. That we are oftentimes, in diversity programming or initiatives that have to do with racism, Asian Americans aren't even included. Like funding mechanisms, like the National Institutes of Health have had like 0.12% funding, right, of clinical research on Asian Americans. So people don't think of Asian Americans as in an underserved, underrepresented group. And so I think we really need to think more about microaggressions and the subtle ways in which Asian Americans are often excluded and just forgotten altogether, right?
Yes.
That then ultimately leads to things like hate. But it doesn't, to tell people like stop Asian hate, most people will be like, not me, I don't hate Asians. You must be talking to them, right? When if the question is really more like, well, are we all complicit in some degree of racism, of treating Asian Americans as invisible, right? Of not thinking about Asian Americans as people of color? Are we all responsible for that in some ways, including Asian Americans? The answer is yes.
Yes, I agree. I feel like it's not like about not being racist. I feel like it's also about being like anti-racist, like at a core, like because I feel like along the lines like to say like, oh, I'm not racist is like creating the Asian Americans' grief like invisible. So in what ways can we make like the invisibility of Asian American grief like visible? Because I feel like in especially like high school curriculum in schools, like we often see a different lens rather than our own when we learn about Asian American cultures, like the backstory, especially like the Vietnam War. I can count more than so much. Like if I had $1 for every time like a US textbook put like Vietnam's war history all wrong, then I'd probably be so rich that I don't have to go to school.
Yeah.
But I like it's like that, like I feel like changes are already made because back in my high school they made like an ethnic class like a requirement now.
Hmm.
And but when I was in high school, that was not a thing. Like we just did
Yeah.
US history and there was no classes being offered. So I feel definitely strides are being made, but like what other ways can we do to make the
We need
invisibility
more,
work?
right? Like, so here's an example.
What
I
more?
volunteered for the makeup art, like, well, I don't know if I volunteered, but the Makeup Artists and Hairstyles Guild of Hollywood, they asked me to go and like kind of give a talk, right? And support them in talking about, stop Asian hate and supporting Black Lives Matter and really kind of addressing anti-Blackness and anti-Asian racism, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that they shared though, right, the guild, and these are like all the makeup artists and hairstylists who work in Hollywood, right? So they're they are the ones that are behind the scenes doing all of the Hollywood films.
Yes.
And one of the things that they said was, we're so glad that with the one of the outcomes, right, unfortunate when it comes to the murder of George Floyd, but that there's been a recognition and increasing awareness then of like, we need more diversity in Hollywood.
Yes.
That's a plus. Okay, so then Hollywood has basically begun to want, right, diversity, and that's been part of their call. Okay, so then of course everybody's excited. So then when Asian Americans apply, whether it's Asian Americans who are actors and actresses or Asian American hairstylists and artists, they're actually applying and then being rejected. And when asked why, the answer has been, sorry, you're not the kind of diversity we're looking for. You're not brown enough.
Yes.
So
I totally agree.
right. So it's this issue of kind of like performative. It's a performative thing to say we want diversity, when what that diversity means is it has to look a certain way. That isn't actually honoring Blackness. That's just pretending to honor Blackness. You know what I mean?
Yes.
But then I think when people see that, they will think like, oh yeah, so it's either Asian or Black. When really, even if they cast Black actors or even if they cast Black stylists, they don't really value Blackness there. It's just that they can be like, check, we included Black people then.
Yes. That is such a powerful notion to notice, because I feel like, have you watched Crazy Rich Asians and Shang-Chi, Dr. Wang?
Yes.
Like as in a conversation, and what I noticed and what I talked about with a lot of my friends is I feel like like moving a step forward, it's about bringing new Asian faces in. Because if we look between the parallels of the movie, I remember when Shang-Chi was coming out, everyone was so excited, but we watched the movie and we see like it's the same faces we often see in Hollywood. Like I feel like half the cast of Shang-Chi was also in Crazy Rich Asians as well. And I was like, it's nice to see them. It's great. Like I feel like it's a celebration. I loved the movies. I really did. But it would be nice to see new faces in Hollywood as well, new Asian faces. But I feel like Hollywood's just using the same people and like denying different people at the same time because they're not what they need on that said checklist you mentioned.
And so this is why maybe when we think about advocacy, how powerful would it be for, and this is, Hollywood representation amongst Asians has largely been Chinese Americans, right? So for Chinese, and I know Simu Liu is Chinese Canadian, right? But for him to say like, hey, we got to include more Southeast Asians. What about South Asian Indians? Because Crazy Rich Asians was critiqued actually for its portrayal of brown Asians, right? That the only, right, what like the security guards outside the mansion. So the anti-Blackness or the kind of the really kind of the colorism, right, within the Asian community, that is still there. So for us to also think about the ways in which we can advocate and speak up for those not at the table amongst the Asian community, right, to be able to elevate each other.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Wang. That was all the questions I had for you, but I want to say I learned a lot in our conversation. Like I learned a great deal that I will be passing on through this interview, and I hope whoever watches gets to take as much away as I did. So thank you so much, Dr. Wang. I very much enjoyed our conversation. Let me end the recording here.
Sure.
And then we could talk a little bit.
Thanks, Marilyn.